Bernie Sanders, what does he think about extending the vote, not just to people who have served time in prison and are now out, they've paid their debt to society, as we say, but are actually still in prison? And in particular, what about people who are serving terms for particularly heinous or violent crimes? He was asked a question at last night's CNN town hall, and the way it was worded was admittedly rough. It was a young woman who was saying, why should people who are in prison for having committed sexual assaults be able to vote? And obviously tough question. Here is how Bernie Sanders answered it.
We live in a moment where cowardly Republican governors are trying to suppress the vote. And in fact, right here, as you may know, in New Hampshire, the legislature and the governor are working hard to make it more difficult for young people to vote. And to me, that is an incredibly undemocratic, un-American process. And I say to those people, by the way, if you don't have the guts to participate in free and fair elections, you should get another job and get out of politics. All right, so we gotta. So here is, and to answer your question, as it happens in my own state of Vermont, from the very first days of our state's history, what our Constitution says is that everybody can vote. That is true. So people in jail can vote. Now, here is my view. If somebody commits a serious crime, sexual assault, murder, they're going to be punished. They may be in jail for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, their whole lives. That's what happens when you commit a serious crime. But I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. Yes, even for terrible people. Because once you start chipping away and you say, well, that guy committed a terrible crime, not gonna let him vote, or that person did that, not gonna let that person vote, you're running down a slippery slope. So I believe that people who commit crimes, they pay the price. When they got out of jail, I believe they certainly should have the right to vote. But I do believe that even if they are in jail, they're paying their price to society, but that should not take away their inherent American right to participate in our democracy.
So look, I think that was a good response for a couple of different reasons. In general, the philosophy that he has towards democracy and voting rights, what he is making clear is that this is not a level playing field. Almost nothing in American politics is in terms of intensity that the different sides approach these different topics. So the people who are fighting to constrain our democracy, to continually cut people out of access to the vote, either literally by the law or in effect their ability to actually vote and register and all of that, they are very committed to that task. And that's why across the country, we see Republican governors in lockstep pushing for things like voter ID and shutting down polling places and purging voter rolls. They all just mysteriously converge on these tactics, and they've been deploying them as often as possible, every chance that they get for, well, as long as we've been alive. But it seems in the last decade or so to be particularly bad. On the other side, there are a lot of people that think that every American should be able to vote and that every American should have access to the vote meaningfully in an easy fashion, increasing how easy it is to register and all of that. But I would argue that those people are not fighting as hard in elected office, people who believe that, as those who are trying to shut down the vote. And that is why we need a politician who believes that we need to be doing everything we can and thinking in innovative ways about how to strengthen democracy against the various assaults that it's sustained over the past decade or longer. And so that is why he cares about making sure that even people in prison can vote. And it is, the way that the question was worded to him was tough. I mean, nobody wants to talk about rights for people who've committed sexual assault, but I think that he responded well. And I mean, think about it. People who end up in prison, in general, aside from completely nonviolent drug-related crimes and stuff like that, like some people will think that they should be deprived of all rights. It's easy in some cases. You take someone who's committed sexual assault, someone who's committed murder, violent pedophiles, things like that. Nobody wants to defend those people. But you can start to, like he said, it's a slippery slope. You can start to widen that circle more and more. And very often, bringing up a slippery slope, I would say, is often a dodge in politics. It's difficult to imagine how we would actually descend down that slippery slope. But in this case, this is not a hypothetical. This is not a concern that if you start to cut people out of the vote, maybe they will try to expand that. We're in the middle of that expansion. It's expanding right now. More and more people are having a harder and harder time voting. And that's why I think that him bringing up the sort of specter of a slippery slope, I think is 100% correct. And again, even in the case of this town hall, I would argue that it is not hypothetical that people would try to make you out to be the villain if you are, as Bernie Sanders is and as some others in this Democratic primary are, trying to expand the vote. It took just a second, actually. So we ran through that bit of the video. I wanna resume 1 second later and look at what direction the moderator for that town hall, Chris Cuomo, decides to take it in.
Applause for the answer. My follow question goes to this being like you're writing an opposition ad against you by saying you think the Boston Marathon bomber should vote not after he pays his debt to society, but while he's in jail. You sure about that?
Well, Chris, I think I have written many 30-second opposition ads throughout my life. This will be just another one. But I do believe, look, this is what I believe. Do you believe in democracy? Do you believe that every single American 18 years of age or older who's an American citizen has the right to vote? Once you start chipping away at that, believe me, that's what our Republican governors all over this country are doing. They come up with all kinds of excuses why people of color, young people, poor people can't vote. And I will do everything I can to resist it. This is a democracy. We've got to expand that democracy. And I believe every single person does have the right to vote.
So look, there are a lot of potential explanations as to why Chris Cuomo used that particular example. Why am I going to come up with, like, I guess arguably one of the worst people, currently locked up in America? It could be that Chris Cuomo is genuinely concerned about how the Boston Marathon bomber would use his vote, who he'd support. That he actually stays up late at night worrying that that one vote would throw an election or that it would get another violent criminal elected into political office. It's possible. Do you believe that that's why? I think it was to generate headlines because he knows that Bernie has obviously thought about that obvious follow-up. And so Bernie is not going to simply say, oh, Boston Marathon bomber, you're right, I hadn't thought of that. You know what, actually, I don't support people in prison voting. I backtrack entirely. No, he's gonna be consistent. All that this does is generate a headline. And the headline is not Bernie Sanders supports expansion of voting rights, Bernie Sanders supports vibrant democracy. The headlines now look like this: Sanders, Boston Marathon bomber should be able to vote from prison. Or if you do a little bit of Googling, you can come up with a whole bunch of other articles. Sanders says the right to vote should be extended even for terrible people like Boston Marathon bomber. Bernie Sanders says Boston Marathon bomber, sexual assaulters should be. Video, Bernie Sanders says even terrible people like the Boston Marathon bomber. We're talking about fundamentally what approach we're going to have to the future of American democracy and expanding the vote. We could have that conversation, or we could be diverted into this, what is this one particularly bad person going to do with their vote? And it is such a disingenuous attempt to both derail that conversation, to stop any actual reform to voting rights in America, but also individually to hurt Bernie Sanders. He came up with that so fast, it was in his mind. You know that, there's lots of terrible people we could mention. And I ask you, are you more worried about what that one individual would do with his vote that you are willing to say to all of the other people in prison, you should have no influence over the future of this country? Do you actually believe that? I don't think Chris Cuomo really believes that, but his question implies that. And he even starts off saying, you're writing an opposition piece for you, but it's not good enough. I'm gonna make it better. I'm gonna generate these headlines and generate a bad news cycle for you while you are doing what seems like an objectively good thing in pursuing your progressive values that say that more people should be able to vote. And the thing is, maybe it seems clever to somebody. It doesn't seem clever to me. You can do this on almost anything if you want to. So the next politician that comes up and says, I want a tax cut for every American, my follow-up question is going to be, oh, that sounds good. You want a tax cut for everyone? Well, there are countless thousands of people who've committed assault and weren't caught, people who've raped and haven't been caught. There are people out there who murdered and weren't caught. You want to give all of those murderers and rapists tax cuts? You want to stick dollars in the pockets of murderers and rapists? Is that a fair question? Of course not. Of course, that's not the point of the policy. That's not the spirit of the policy, whether I agree with the policy or not. That's not what Bernie Sanders is trying to accomplish. His goal is not to make sure that a murderer has more say in what happens in this country. It is to hold up what is best in American democracy. And the thing is, you do lose a lot of rights when you go to prison. Obviously, you can't leave if you want to. But does anyone believe that a person who's in there for tax fraud shouldn't have any say over literally the future of prison policy in this country? And again, I understand that What I am doing right now in standing up for the rights of people who I fundamentally disagree with, some of whom are terrible people, I suffer the same potential risk that Bernie Sanders suffers. Nobody wants to stand up for these people because of the threat, the stigma, the fact that it will seem like you prefer those people over others when that's not at all what you're doing. And I hate these diversions. It reminds me of back during the 2016 election when Bernie Sanders had his higher education policy, Hillary Clinton had hers. They were fundamentally different. Hers had some good things to it. I was not fundamentally opposed to all of what she was saying. I liked his 4 years of free public education more. And there were arguments against it, good ones and bad ones. And one bad one that was deployed by Hillary Clinton was Bernie Sanders wants to make it free for Donald Trump's children to go to public schools. That is such a disingenuous argument. And it's a way to make us stab ourselves, a way to make us not support what is in our own economic best interests. That I would say all the kids that could benefit from free 4 years of public education shouldn't get that right because I'm worried that Barron Trump is gonna go to UConn. Does anybody actually follow that argument through to its natural conclusion? No. The goal is to distract you, it is to divert you, it is to cause you to not support what is in your own best interests. When it comes to voting rights in the one case, education in the other. There are millions of people in America's prisons. Some of them are domestic terrorists, some of them are murderers, lots of them aren't. Lots of them are in prison because our entire justice system is fundamentally screwed up and they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't have been there in the first place, or many of them certainly shouldn't have been there for as long as they were. Should those people have no say in what happens in their country? I don't actually believe that. I don't think that most people do, and I hope that they're able to see through these sorts of political games. But as one example that this is working, that strategy that you saw in the town hall is working, Don Jr. tweeted, "What does it say about the modern day Democrat Party that Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris seem more concerned about giving mass murderers like the Boston Marathon bomber voting rights than protecting the civil rights of law-abiding American citizens who legally own guns?" Just so obviously I hate that. Quick note, look at that. He says they want to give these murderers the right to vote rather than, and note, he doesn't say then to make it easier for people not in prison to vote. He totally forgets about the voting thing and turns to gun rights. By the way, Kamala Harris does deserve some credit. She said that this is a conversation that we should have, expanding the vote to them. That's not as good as saying that they should be able to vote or that, but it's something. So I will give her that much support at least. Thank you very much for watching this clip from the Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.